Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to National Inclusion Week, which has come to Cornwall via the Inclusivity Project. And the Inclusivity Project is a small project that's based at the University of Exeter and partnered with Disability Cornwall and Age UK Cornwall and Isles of Scilly and the Local Enterprise Partnership. And together, we've been working over the last year and a half to work with local businesses to try and overcome barriers to including more people who are 50 plus and who have a disability or a long-term health condition in the workplace. So, National Inclusion Week is right up our street, and we're so glad that you're here watching with us today, being part of National Inclusion Week and Inclusion Week in Cornwall. We're here at Cornwall Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here with Daniel Derbyshire from University of Exeter, or Dr. Daniel Derbyshire, to give him his proper title. He's a researcher, and he's going to be talking to us today about unconscious bias. And our special guest today, John Negus from Cornwall Chamber of Commerce, who has volunteered to take an implicit bias test and find out his own level of bias right here, right now with us. Brave man. Thank you for being here with us, John.
You're very welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
What are you expecting to discover today, John?
I'm expecting to discover that I have a considerable number of unconscious biases. And we'll be very interested to see how bad they are. And obviously interested in what one can do about it.
Great. This is a really good example for businesses because well, maybe Dan, why don't you explain why is this so important, this example that John's setting for businesses to understand their own bias?
So I think it's important for businesses to understand their unconscious biases, because especially in terms of their recruitment and retention processes, it can really narrow the pool of people that they're kind of appealing to when they recruit and retain people. And it's clear from evidence within the literature that the wider the pool of people that you recruit from, on average, the higher level of quality of people that you're going to get. So there's a clear business case for kind of having a more inclusive recruitment and retention policy, which then leads to greater workforce inclusion.
And just before we dive in and get John started on his test, can you please explain to us what's the difference between being prejudiced against a group of people, like prejudiced against disabled people or prejudiced against older workers,
Sure,
and discriminating against them, and having unconscious bias?
Sure. So I think that there's a few important things to point out about unconscious bias. And the first is that it's natural. The second is that it's kind of unintended. And the third is that it affects most of the population. So, for example, the test that we're about to do, 80% of people show a strong or moderate bias against people with disabilities when they do it. And the other thing to think about is that, or the way I like to think about it is that this unconscious bias just only occurs in the mind. It occurs like in your head, basically. And the difference when it becomes kind of either prejudice or outright discrimination is when that kind of thought becomes action. And so I think that's kind of the key difference that I like to draw between the two.
So if you discover what your bias is, you then have the chance to make the choices that would not result in discrimination.
Exactly.
Because you can sidestep or outsmart your bias.
Exactly.
But only if you know it's there.
Yeah, completely.
And so, John, when we were chatting this morning, you were talking a bit about your upbringing and the era of your upbringing.
Yeah, it was a very, very long time ago. My formative years were the 1970s in the East End of London, which was a different world to what it is now, particularly with regards to gender, race, disability, the whole suite. Completely different world. But I rather suspect there are some ghosts lurking in my subconscious from that period, be very interested to see what this comes up with.
Right, and that's exactly what we're talking about here, isn't it? We're talking about the ways that just who we surround ourselves with, the images we've seen, what's become normal for us has just gently seeped into our idea of what normal is. And that is an imbalanced idea of what normal is that hangs around and is weighted in favour of the majority. And that's all we're talking about here. We're not talking about trying to reveal somebody's dark side of their personality or anything. And that's why, you know, when you first talked about the bias test, I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if I even dare to take one and discover that I have bias.
Sure.
But if you don't know what you've got, you don't know what you're working with.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an important point. A lot of this unconscious bias is kind of shaped by society, and especially by like media narratives as well. Because I think, or media representation, in the case of like people with disabilities, for example, where like we obviously partner with Disability Cornwall, and they spoke about like how that media representation really does matter. And so I think that the role that unconscious bias plays is kind of like it's formed by society, but it's also kind of a legacy effect as well. That there's like you said, that like we've gone through a lot of social change over the last kind of 50 years, but there's still kind of that kind of those unconscious associations are still kind of implicit in a lot of our media, a lot of our narratives.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So shall we get John set up taking the test?
Yeah.
It's going to take about 15 minutes for John to do the test, and he's going to do it while we're chatting. But let's get him set up to take it, and then you can see a little bit what that's going to be like for somebody who would like to take the test, because in a week's time, Dan's got set up with the facility so that any of you who have a business and would like to know, hey, hold on, do I have some unconscious bias that I should know about? It might be affecting my recruitment processes or any of my decisions around my business. Maybe I should take the test. Then that is brilliant because Dan's going to have the facility to do that. So he's getting John set up on the laptop. I'm going to take this laptop over there and just show people on this stream what John is doing. You can describe to people a little bit, Dan, what John is doing. He's just...
So like you say, I'll just go through the last things that I know to be ready for anyone by hopefully this time next week. So the test consists of basically pictures and words appear on the screen, and those will either be kind of good words or bad words, as well as pictures of either, in this case, this is the version of the test for disabled people. So the pictures will either be of disabled people or non-disabled people. And the way the test works is you're supposed to categorize these on the screen using kind of left and right keys. And the idea is that we put, and the order is randomized, but you either have good and disabled people together on the same side or good and non-disabled people on the same side. And you do that, and then, for example, it will switch the other way. And so the test measures the difference in reaction times when you need to associate good and disabled people compared to when you need to associate good and non-disabled people. Because the idea is that people kind of experience a cognitive dissonance. They kind of struggle mentally when they need to put good and disabled people together. Because, like I was just saying, like in terms of these media narratives, societal kind of norms that we've established, it's difficult to associate good and disabled compared to good and non-disabled.
Right.
And so there's a visible difference in reaction time.
But what if I really want to have a good result? Can I cheat?
It's difficult to cheat if you're kind of doing the test in a sincere way. And there is evidence that like there's been some studies on this, and people don't really figure out how to cheat. The only way to cheat is to like deliberately be really, really slow and sluggish when you're doing it. Whereas if you're kind of doing it earnestly, you can't like. It's difficult to cheat, basically, is what the evidence shows.
So is John taking the test now?
Don't think it's quite that big. I think it's just finishing up the survey part.
Okay, so there's a survey part to begin with, and what's that checking out, Dan?
So the survey is basically some basic questions about demographics. There's also questions about your work environment, size of company you work for, whether you're involved in recruitment and retention decisions. Because at the Inclusivity Project, we're really interested in how this unconscious bias can potentially affect your recruitment and retention. And so we're kind of interested in doing this test with, in particular, people who work for small and medium-sized businesses in Cornwall who are involved in recruitment and retention decisions, basically.
And that's going to be part of the second part of your research. So gathering bias data is the first part of your research, isn't it, Dan? And then the second part is to do with recruitment processes.
Exactly. So we're going to be looking at using the insights from this unconscious bias stuff, as well as some of the other researches on inclusivity. We're going to be designing what's known as a choice experiment. And the idea was then that we would look at, amongst our target population of kind of older people and people with disabilities, you do this thing where you offer 2 different jobs, which have a kind of, say, 5 or 6 salient attributes about them, which would include obviously things like the salary, the number of hours you work per week. It could be whether you can work from home or not, different things like this. And we ask you which job you prefer, and then we show you 2 different jobs. We keep changing these different attributes. And once you've done a certain number of them, we can kind of see how much monetary value you'd be placing on each of those. Because, for example, you may accept a lower salary if you can work from home, or if you work less hours per week. Or we want to figure out, in terms of older people and disabled people, which of those kind of things would really make the most difference to them. So the businesses can kind of tailor not only their recruitment and retention practices, but also their actual job offers, the job descriptions, the job roles.
That's really important, isn't it? Because it could be that bias is showing up in just your job adverts, for example, and that unwittingly you're using language that disabled people or people with long-term health conditions or older people would look at and then self-exclude from the process because they thought, if it says that, it's not for me.
The use of language is really important. And, an example I used before in one of our events was that Thames Water were looking to recruit engineers for their water maintenance team, and they were realising that the majority of the applications, I think it was above 90%, were coming from men. And they went through the kind of job descriptions that they were posting and removed certain words, which were considered to kind of be masculine words. And suddenly their ratio of kind of male to female applicants shot up to 55% male, 45% female. So the use of language can make a massive difference in terms of who sees themselves as your potential employee.
Yeah, and who has the confidence to sort of fit themselves into the role that you're offering. Yeah,
absolutely.
Let's see. I just want to see if John's actually taking the test yet, or if he's still doing the survey. But I don't want to disturb him. Yeah, I think he's doing it. Now. It's so exciting and so brave of him to take this test live with us today as well. So while he's taking the test, Dan, take a seat.
Sure.
Please will you tell us, where did this bias test come from, right? You didn't invent it.
No.
What's the history of it?
So the test's known as Harvard test, mainly within the literature, or the implicit association test. It was developed in the mid to late 90s by a team at Harvard, obviously, who were originally interested in race. And so a lot of the research in this kind of using this test is based on race, especially in American context.
Right, and that's pretty relevant to today's cultural shift.
And so now that the kind of it's been expanded, so there are versions of the test for kind of any different kind of attribute of different people that you can think about, as well as mental health and things like that. And so obviously the obvious ones like race, religion, gender.
So implicit bias tests exist on all of these different, what would you call them? Attributes, right. And today, John is doing the disability one.
Exactly.
And your research is focused on the disability one and the age one.
And the age version as well, yeah.
Right.
So we're just getting John to do the disability one today, but when we put it live, it'll be do the disability one and then the age one after it.
Right.
Or the other way around.
Right. And so we're especially interested in making this available to small to medium-sized businesses in Cornwall who would like to take the opportunity of this cultural moment to say, okay, how can I be more inclusive? How can I be more diverse? Maybe one really easy way of doing that is just to understand our own bias that little bit better.
Yeah, well, just to be clear as well, it's not exclusive to those people. So anyone will be able to take the test, whether they're in Cornwall, not in Cornwall, work for a small business or a big business, anyone free.
It's open to anyone, just the curious people. So even my dad.
Yeah, but you are right that we are especially after kind of people at small and medium-sized businesses in Cornwall.
And that's super useful to you for your research, because you get to know what the kind of general attitude is within Cornwall.
And also the Harvard people that I mentioned, they kind of compile a public data set because they have a version of their test as well, which anyone can go and do. And so they've got a database which by now has been populated with about 20 years of data. So they've got about 1 million different responses to it. And so you can kind of compare, once we've got our example of Cornwall, we can kind of compare how that looks nationally, globally.
Right.
Because consistently, for example, with the disability version, you see that about 80% of people, there are 7 different categories of bias. 1 which is no bias, and then 3 in either direction, which is, for example, slightly biased against disabled people, moderately biased against disabled people, or strongly. 80% of people end up as either moderately or strongly biased against disabled people, for example. It's slightly better with age, but shows you that it's kind of still quite a big proportion of the population that are showing. Most people show some bias, even if it's only slight, but a lot of people.
Do you know what the statistics are of people who think they're biased before they begin?
Yes, this is one of the key things that we do. One of the questions asks for people's explicit bias. So the question literally says, which statement best describes you?
Yes.
And it says, for example, I strongly prefer disabled people to non-disabled people, all the way down to the other version, which is I strongly prefer non-disabled to disabled people. And of course, 80% plus, maybe even 90% plus, people say that they have no bias at all. Some people admit a slight bias, but very few people say they have a strong bias, for example. So that does show you this kind of difference between explicit and implicit bias, which I think does show, which basically I think demonstrates that it is unconscious.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me how many conversations I've had, like outside of work, about the work that you're doing here for the Inclusivity Project, Dan.
Thanks.
Especially since the Black Lives Matter movement started in the States, and we all started to talk about, racism and the difference between racism and bias. And it seemed to me that there's been a real moment of awakening when people started to go, oh, right, it's not enough to just not be racist. It's actually important that we all kind of discover the way that we've been taught to lean and try deliberately to lean in the other direction. This is similar, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's just about kind of rethinking kind of the conventional wisdom, if you like, of what we've been told by the media and society, based on these kind of, like you say, these changing social attitudes that we've had over the last 40, 50 years. And like you say, this one does really feel like a moment in terms of the race agenda, for example. But then there's still a lot of work to do in terms of other things. For example, Black Lives Matter is massive at the moment. Also, Black Trans Lives Matter is massive, because like often the Black trans community feel excluded, even by things like Black Lives Matter. And so there's always still kind of intersectional elements that need to be kind of thought through and included, I think.
Yeah. And what do you think about, like, we're talking about this cultural moment, but it's also come right at the same moment as coronavirus. And what do you think about what inclusion means in the context of Cornwall, coronavirus, the over 50s, and disability right now? Because surely there's work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we can see it as an opportunity, because it looks like we're going to be really changing the kind of ways that we work, or if we haven't already, but they're going to change kind of in permanent ways going forward forever. And that won't necessarily be the more model that we're at now, but it may be some hybrid of what we had before and what we're doing now. And it's important to make sure that we kind of do that in an inclusionary way, and that we don't recreate the same barriers that existed in our kind of physical environment in the digital environment.
That's such a good point, that we're actually at a point where we're remaking the workplace. So now's the chance to make it inclusive. And that's why this week at the Inclusivity Project, we're really trying to get off the ground the hashtag emerge inclusive. And so if you're tweeting or reposting this on Facebook, as well as putting the hashtag Inclusion Week 2020. Please use the hashtag Emerge Inclusive. John Lucas, have you got a result?
I have a result.
Okay. Over to you, Dan, to talk through the results. Do you want to come closer to the screen, John?
Yeah.
And emerge out of the background.
So do you want to just talk about how it was? Was it hard to do or fun process?
It was easy to do. You do have to read the screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
To make sure that you are functioning correctly.
It's true. It does require a few minutes of concentration while you're actually doing the test part.
Yeah. So it's not something you can do whilst doing something else. If you see what I mean.
No, that's completely true. And I should mention that. You couldn't do it, for example, while watching TV in the background, or I wouldn't recommend that you do it while doing that, because you do need to pay attention and focus. Because the idea is that you're supposed to go as quickly as you can, because that's why we measure the reaction times. And so if you're getting distracted by this or that, then that will affect your reaction times. And so you're right, Clive.
Yeah, but no, it's a simple. It's really quite interesting. I would question some of its attributions, particularly some of the associated words, whether they're good or bad. But that's probably just me. It suggests that I have a strong anti-disability bias, which I'm not at all surprised at.
Well, no, like I said, I mean, someone doing 40-50% of the population in that strong category.
Yeah. Knowing that, of course, makes me more conscious of the way that I think, particularly with regard to recruitment.
Do you recruit Chamber? Are you part of the recruitment process?
Yes. In fact, at the moment, we're looking for 7 additional members of staff, which for a small team is quite a considerable take on. And as a result of that, I will be more conscious of my attitudes towards anybody who presents with a disability, if they feel inclined to tell us about it.
And I think that often when you see kind of what are the steps that you can take to become unconscious bias, the first one is always to be conscious of it. And so I think that's kind of the important first step, and that's part of the wider context around the research that I want to be doing, is kind of raising that conversation, basically, and just raising kind of awareness to be conscious of these kind of things. But I think that's also interesting what you were just saying at the end about whether people actually choose to disclose the disability, because I think that unconscious bias is kind of a big driver of why people often choose not to, because they think that if they disclose that they have a disability, either at the application stage or during the interview, if it's kind of something that's not necessarily visible, that they assume that they're going to get a certain reaction because of these kind of unconscious biases, which are still prevalent within society. Even if it's not an explicit reaction, that it will be in the person's head.
Yeah.
So even if it's not knowing whether you, the interviewer, has the bias or not, but just an expectation that people will have bias.
I think so.
So what else could John do and Chamber do when he's recruiting these 7 other people to help sidestep his own bias?
Sure. So the other steps that people talk about in terms of overcoming bias, like I say, the first is to be conscious of it. The other is to take time when making decisions, because these unconscious biases, as we've kind of seen by the way that the test works, they happen quickly and instantaneously in the brain. They're just associations that the brain makes instantly, rather than well thought out reasoned decisions. So that if you kind of step back and think about it, then like you said, go back and reconsider that disabled candidate again, that you'll make better decisions. And another one is to kind of make decisions in wider teams where possible, and in particular in wider diverse teams. So not necessarily, the classic example of all white men making the decisions, but to have a diverse team of people making those decisions. And so it could be, for example, with a small to medium-sized employer, where often it's the owner manager doing all of that. They write the job description, they choose who to interview, they conduct the interviews, they choose who to hire. Whereas in big businesses, that may be several different people along the chain, or at least groups of people at any given step. Often that's just a single person with an SME. And so if they could, for example, involve the staff that they do have in that decision making, what do you think of these CVs, who would you choose? But especially if they have a diverse team already, that will lead to even better decision making.
The Chamber, of course, it does have its own equality and diversity policy. which says all the right things. Generally speaking, our recruitment process is that we will put out an advert. We will receive 100 or so applicants, which can be fairly quickly whittled down.
Sure.
But once we're down to the shortlist, we would normally involve not just myself and the CEO who will make the decision, but also other members of the team into which that recruitment slot is going to be placed. Bearing in mind that other members of the team will also have their own bias and prejudices.
Yeah.
Sometimes I suspect being overcome quite consciously and possibly sometimes overly overcome.
What does that mean?
You may very well have a bias, but current social conditioning means that you overcompensate for it.
So you were still not dealing fairly.
Yeah, but it may lead you to look at somebody with a disability and give them greater credence, which may not be merited.
I wonder how the changing working situation, you've probably been working from home for the last few months, and then you're offering these positions out. Will you be looking for people? Are you able to offer greater flexibility now, do you think, in terms of accessibility to those positions?
The Chamber itself is quite fortunate in that its office is all on one level. However, if you want to go to the toilet, you've got a flight of stairs to contend with. So that is a consideration. I would suspect that anybody coming with a physical disability might find that a challenge. Equally, I would suspect that it's not one that they would highlight in the recruitment process. But I assume that anybody with a disability would have their domestic environment sorted to accommodate that. And with the rapid rise in remote or home working, that would mean that disability can be more easily accommodated.
Yeah.
So it's
less of a barrier. Probably is access issues like that are exactly the kind of thing that Access to Work grants would cover for anyway. That's really good to hear that you're able to offer that flexibility. Do you hope that people who are from a really diverse background and diverse age range and diverse set of abilities apply for your positions?
Oh, very much so, yeah. The Chamber is quite fortunate in that we have always attempted to get a wide range of folk involved. Given that Cornwall does not have a particularly diverse pool of individuals, but certainly age-wise, there are old cronies like myself, and I won't mention anybody else, but they know that they are, right through to young folk straight out of uni or straight out of college, and I think that is to our benefit.
Well, I mean, like you were saying about like kind of having bigger interview panels than kind of just one or two people.
Yeah.
For example, when I was interviewed to get my job, I think interview panels went like 5 or 6 people at the university, and it's kind of pretty standard. But like I say, often with a small business, but if they were going to involve the staff, I think that would be kind of definitely an important place for them to consider involving some of the staff, and just get one of their staff members to sit in on the interviews, for example.
Yeah.
Because often that's where a lot of people come across. But also, I think probably the two key phases, the ones that you can work on using is the choosing who to interview and then the actual interview process itself.
Super. So, John, if any businesses are watching this who are curious about taking the bias test, what would you tell them?
Oh, give it a go, absolutely. It is really quite revealing, both on a personal level and through that, how it reflects on your business. Take the test, think about the results, and I'm sure it'll be beneficial to any business.
Great. And Dan, where should people come if they want to take the test and get on a mailing list so that they hear about it when you've got this up online for everybody to be able to take?
They should go to the Inclusivity Project website, of course.
Okay, which is www.theinclusivityproject.co.uk. And you can hear there all about all of the other events that we've got going on this week as part of National Inclusion Week. We've got live streams and webinars taking place all through the week. Tomorrow we'll be talking with Disability Cornwall, especially about the work they've been doing to help make town centres accessible, especially with retailers having to alter the layouts of their shops with special partitioning and so forth with coronavirus, keeping accessibility in mind there. And they're reworking their Every Customer Counts program, which is a kind of self-assessment service, like a kite mark that you can get for your business in order to see how accessible you would be to a wide range of customers. Later on in the week, we'll be live on Chaos TV. We'll be talking about the prospects of older workers in the workplace and how they are finding resilience in a coronavirus economic environment. And we'll be talking to a couple of small businesses who've taken, funded by the European Regional Development Fund, in order to boost their businesses and to get off the ground ideas that help accessibility and workplace well-being. So you'll be able to find out where you can come if you're interested in getting support for your business, or you've got a bright idea around workplace well-being that you would like support and funding for. And on Friday, we've got a Twitter Q&A in association with Cornwall Link and Age UK Cornwall. Loads of places to find us this week. Once again, you can find out the full schedule on www.theinclusivityproject.co.uk. So come along and join in all of the events that we've got going on this week. And thank you so much for tuning in and watching us this morning and being part of our first Inclusion Week event. From me, Laura Lloyd, Dr. Daniel Derbyshire and John Negus, goodbye and thank you.
Goodbye.
Super. Thank you very much, guys.